Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And I am joined by my good friend Dr. Philip Chase, who is sneaking on his jacket. I caught him unprepared. The leather elbow patches. So what we had there, ladies and gentlemen, was showing off the guns, then putting on the jacket with the leather elbow patches.
Boy, you caught me in various acts there. I forgot to put my jacket on before we hit record, but now it's on so I can be Dr. Fantasy properly.
Well, it's always good to know that you need to put on the clothes to become that person.
Oh yeah, are you kidding me? Yeah.
Is this the clothes maketh the man?
Indeed. Yeah, right.
Um,
Which is better than the Emperor's new clothes.
oh, that's on your OnlyFans site?
No.
And I would also like to remind everyone that, of course, Philip is currently employed as an actual professor of literature, and I've
Yes.
just
Yeah.
made a joke about that his students may find out about.
Oh, ooh. Well, that's okay. I have tenure. So.
So today, Philip, we're on. Is this video 6?
Number 6 in our series of archetypes.
Archetypes and tropes. And today we are going to talk a bit about the ruler archetype and the explorer archetype, both of which are fascinating. And again, we find some of these, sometimes it's easier to describe through the negative, that shadow archetype that is sort of their dark counterpart. But with these two, these are so readily found in fantasy. Like, these are two very, very common. And weirdly enough, because of that, it's quite difficult sometimes finding a single character that encapsulates that one thing. Because
Yeah.
if we start with the explorer, I like to think of the explorer sort of archetype as someone who sets out to see the world, who sets out to find new places, to find new cultures, to experience all these things. Very much like what we saw in the original Star Trek, this voyage to the stars to find and explore. But
Hmm.
when we think of a lot of fantasy, particularly epic fantasy and quest fantasy, we have characters who frequently go from their insular or small or backward little place, and then they head out on adventure to see the world. And so in a lot of respects, the explorer is built into aspects of the quest group and aspects of these heroes on their journeys. So like, what do you think about it when you think of the explorer?
Well, it's certainly one archetype that goes way back. And you mentioned in before we started recording Odysseus as being a sort of a prototype in a way. Although, as you also mentioned, he's on his way back home. So it's a reverse explorer in a way, or he's exploring where he doesn't necessarily want to. But it is certainly an archetype that goes way back, and one that I think a lot of fantasy authors successfully plug in, perhaps because it does speak to some human yearning to see the big world out there, and to expand our horizons, and to just one's sense of adventure, and that sort of thing. So it's a very fitting archetype for fantasy, and as you said, it's a very common one, and I think we have some good examples, but as always, I know our viewers are going to come up with some excellent ones. Do you want to start off with one? You mentioned
Well, there's actually
Tasselhoff. Or...
there's Tasselhoff Barefoot from Dragonlance, which I think is a great example, because it
Yeah,
ties into one of the concepts that we previously talked about, the innocent, but
yeah.
also, and they're not a main character of the Wheel of Time, but Jane Farstrider, the references to Jane Farstrider in the Wheel of Time, and I think these are both good examples to talk about. So if we talk initially about Tasselhoff. Tasselhoff as a Kender has wanderlust, and he wants to head out to see the world, to experience adventure. And I'm hesitant to pin the explorer on Tasselhoff, because in a lot of respects Tasselhoff is also the innocent, and that's the
Uh-huh.
role that Tasselhoff plays very much in that trilogy by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman.
Uh-huh.
But his drive is that wanderlust, that needing to move on, to see new places, to experience new cultures, to see
Hmm.
new things, adventure, excitement, all the things a Jedi shouldn't crave.
Uh-huh.
And we see that, I think, mirrored more clearly, without the innocent aspect, in the character of Jane Farstrider, who appears quite often referenced in the text as the consummate explorer and adventurer, who they all refer to, these tales of Jane Farstrider that they read as children, about his adventures and these strange worlds that he visited, and the weird people. And it mimics very much those stories that we get from mythology of characters like Odysseus, that, oh, we went to this island that was uncharted and no one had seen before, and there were giant one-eyed people. And you
Hmm.
go, oh yes, Odysseus, and how much have you been drinking? But that sense of finding the new, finding the joy of exploring, and we see that in our own world when people go, I'm going traveling around the world for a year. um that desire to go somewhere new, to find something new, to break away from a perceived rut or paradigm that they are in.
Yeah, yeah. We see that desire, that joy in the character Althea Vestrit in the Live Ship Traders trilogy by Robin Hobb as well. She is certainly someone who has sailing in her blood and wants to see the world. And part of that is very much the relationship with her ship and her family's legacy and all that. But she is certainly, I think, a great example of someone with that urge, with that drive to just venture out and go out and be free and sail the seas and so forth. So I
And
think she's a
she
great example.
uh, and she contrasts so neatly with Kenneth, who
Yes.
is the shadow archetype of the raider, because Kenneth has that same drive of going to all these new places, but for him it's always to take, it's
Yep.
always to accumulate, it is acquisitive, it is about his own personal power. Whereas
Yep.
for Althea, it's the joy of being out there. And I think
Yeah.
that's a really nice dichotomy that we can set up between those two.
That's a great insight. And yes, for everyone who hasn't been watching the series thus far, we have been discussing these archetypes in terms of their, so the main archetype we discuss is the good archetype, but then there is the shadow, which is sort of the flip side of the archetype. And in the case of the explorer, the flip side, the other side of the coin, is the raider. So, and as AP just said, Kenneth is a perfect example of the raider, someone who goes out and acquires and takes. And this is the essential distinction between the good archetype and the shadow archetype, which is that the shadow archetype is selfish, takes, whereas the good archetype tends to interact in the world in a way that is more positive, that takes other people into account. So that would be a great distinction right there within that series, Live Ship Traders, I think. Excellent example. Not all explorers are happy people, though. There are some examples, I think, of explorers who have perhaps become a bit jaded by their experiences, or perhaps the exploring is a response to the troubles of life and a path to some kind of freedom. And an example of that might be Saren Pettick in the Malazan books, who was introduced in the 5th book in Midnight Tides. She is, what's her title? Aquitor or something like that. Is that
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
Aquator.
Aquitor. And her role is to guide people in various places that she knows. She is a guide, essentially, but a type of explorer, I suppose, as well. So exploring as a means of escape, I think, is perhaps one facet of that as well.
And I think this is where we can see that while we're honing in on an aspect, the motivations behind it that authors use to construct character and how they build it out can be very, very complicated.
Yeah.
Saren's dissatisfaction with being hemmed in the city, you know, we could make a parallel to Tasselhoff Barefoot's Wanderlust. But in Tasselhoff's case, it's much more positive. It's this need to go and find new. It's a positive desire to move forward. With Saren, it's more a need to escape, which you can see can have negative connotations associated with it.
Right.
So just because we're describing it in these sort of like the good archetype versus the shadow archetype, again, anytime we make these very broad, general, and we're talking about these abstract notions, when we are talking about characters, when we discuss characters, they are much more sophisticated and complex. And we start to see how, while at the core, the character might have that drive can be represented or manipulated in certain ways by an author to create truly unique characters.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's
Although
fascinating.
sometimes you do just get the stereotype, such as I would argue in the Farseer trilogy with the Red Ship Raiders, who are called the Red Ship Raiders literally, but they are, I think, a pretty, at least in that trilogy. I understand that later on they might be a little more developed, but in the Farseer trilogy itself, they just seem like raiders, and they're definitely destructive and acquisitive, just kind of bad. We don't really get too much subtlety, not much nuance with them really at all. So
And
then that can serve a purpose, right?
and again, remember, narrative function. Narrative is so complicated that
Yeah.
certain things having a narrative function, if they're well realized, they don't need to have huge amounts of character depth and backstory at that moment, as long as they are properly integrated into the narrative. But when we think of the Red Ship Raiders, like, this is a common trope, stereotype, more so than archetype, that we see is the use of a Viking analog, because obviously for a lot of Anglophone literature, the Vikings were the terrors on the seas. They raided everywhere. That is the thing that they did. They went a Viking. And that's why I think when we see Viking analogs, even if they are potentially being tried to be disguised, as we see in A Song of Ice and Fire, yes, you can look at that and go, really? What was it they say when they drown? Is what has been drowned can't die again. They're Vikings in different clothing. But when we have that, the raiding, quite often Northmen raiding from the north, barbarians raiding down, we see a lot of this because of that sort of cultural anxiety that a lot of the Anglophone countries had, or a lot of the European countries had, about the Vikings sweeping down from the north. So we see that replicated because it is part and parcel of this history in Anglophone fantasy.
Yeah. And again, once again, the raider is, of course, the shadow side of the explorer, and we've given several examples of explorers. One more that I thought of is Longfoot from the First Law trilogy, who is again a guide, a bit like Saren, but a little bit there for more, I think, more comedic effect than anything else. And as he gets continuously threatened by Pharaoh Malgene. But he's certainly somebody with that impulse to see the world and catalog the places that he sees, and a sense of adventure, wanting to see new things, and that kind of just that young excitement that you have when you just want to go out and have an adventure, which is definitely so central to fantasy, isn't it? So
yeah, and sort of one last point I think about the explorer that I find very interesting is obviously explorers in our world, depending on whether or not you were on the side of the explorer going out, or if you were in that land that the explorer found and discovered, the reputation of an explorer, what the concept of exploration means, can be very, very different. And that is something that perhaps this archetype shows, again, because of narrative perspective, because of the perspective of the view of the character. Someone from one culture can see an explorer very much in the vein of the adventurer going out to discover these new places, but someone from the land that gets discovered could see them very much as a raider. And it all has to do with perception of that sort of motivation, perception of what happens. And we have seen devastating consequences of explorers from history and what they did. So I think that's an interesting balance that we get to this particular archetype. that it
Yeah.
is there are positive aspects to this desire to learn about the new, but there can be dire consequences. There can be horrific consequences. So
Yeah.
it's a very interesting one.
Yeah, indeed.
But do you want to move on then so we can talk a wee bit about what was the next one that we were doing?
The ruler slash tyrant.
Oh, a juicy one that comes up in fantasy with all of its kingdoms and its empires, all of these things that we see wrapped up in fantasy. So, Philip, give me your opening thoughts on the ruler and the tyrant.
Yeah, it's a big one, and I think you obviously can give many historical examples. I mean, there's just too many to talk about, from Julius Caesar to King Henry the Eighth. There's just so many we could pick on. Elizabeth the First. Some, and I do believe that once again, though we have the two sides of the coin, ruler tyrant, you can easily see slippage between them in most of the figures. Maybe some good rulers with good intentions slipping into the tyrant, or occasionally even a tyrant who exhibits traits of a good ruler. So it's not so simple as either or here. Although some of the examples will be a little more dualistic, I think, and Lord of the Rings might be a great place to start in respect to that, because here you have, I think, a great example of a more dualistic view of ruler versus tyrant in Aragorn versus Denethor, right?
Yeah, and that is an excellent example because, of course, the Lord of the Rings is very much from a very particular narrative perspective about the return of the king, putting Aragorn back on the throne, and he is meant to be the best of humanity. He's noble, he's caring. It's a life of service to his people. We can see these as great traits to a ruler, to a king. He the houses of healing and what happens to Faramir and Eowyn, like that is part of his service to his people. He cares. But we can contrast that with Denethor, although a steward, the previous ruler of the Gondorian people. And Denethor is cruel and he is malicious and he is selfish and he is a tyrant. He orders the burning of Faramir because he doesn't want to wait. He doesn't care. And everything is that short-sighted, his whim, egotistical, inward-facing, and doesn't care about being a good ruler, doesn't care about the relationship with the riders of Rohan. He doesn't care about these things. He is, and it's depicted wonderfully, maybe perhaps exaggerated slightly in the Peter Jackson version, with that scene of him stuffing his face and the food dripping out of his mouth and eating messily, and that focus on those noises, because it's actually quite off-putting. And that Jackson put that in very specifically to show him as a bad ruler.
Yeah, you used the word short-sighted, and I think it is, so much of it boils down to a matter of vision. So the ruler is someone with a vision for the kingdom, with a vision for others, looking outside oneself, whereas the tyrant Denethor, very much self-absorbed, very much limited, with blinkered vision. So that is the distinction that is made once again on a larger scale between these various archetypes. When we talk about the good archetype versus the shadow one, it's a focus on others versus a focus on self. So that certainly fits with the overall pattern that we've been talking about here. And then Lord of the Rings has some other great examples, plenty of examples of rulers. You have Galadriel is another one in there, and Elrond, who have their own little tiny portions of Middle Earth that they are trying to protect. They're, as you said, I think earlier, they're a bit isolationist in that respect. But
just a touch. Think of how Lothlorien is protected and viewed by other people.
yeah,
Like, Lothlorien is a wee bit bristly, but once you know the secret password, once you know the special handshake, they're all have a cloak, have a badge. Here you go. But walk in uninvited and you get extreme acupuncture to the face.
This is true. Well, I mean, we got tons of examples that we can give. Again, let's go to maybe a different series then. How about the Malazan Book of the Fallen, one near and dear to us? Loads of examples of both, the whole spectrum, really, I think, from, maybe it is better to think of these as a spectrum rather than either or, but you do have lots of rulers and tyrants, some characters who are literally called tyrants. But then you have your Calors, right, in there, who are quite the tyrants, quite tyrannical characters. Without huge spoilers in here, I think that's a general enough statement. Darujhistan in Gardens of the Moon is a place where the word tyrant comes up, right?
And it also has a very specific meaning in Darujhistan, but it goes to this very specific thing that Darujhistan was ruled by a series of tyrants, and it's one of the plot points of Gardens of the Moon about Rhaist, a tyrant, and we get that short insight into how Rhaist thought about the people and his joy in how he manipulated them, how he controlled them for his own amusement, and you can see how that very clearly fits the title of tyrant. That it is about his pleasure, his power, his amusement. But we can maybe contrast that with other characters that are trying to think of what is best for the Empire and love her or hate her.
Yeah.
Lysine is one of those characters who apparently thinks only about what is best for the Empire.
Right.
Now, she may or may not succeed in your own personal estimation. You may think she's very flawed, but you can see she is reaching for that to be a good ruler. She is reaching for that archetype. That is her aspiration. Maybe she doesn't have the ability to get there, but all of her actions seem to be very much focused on what is good for the Empire. And we have seen how people will say, oh, well, that was terrible for the Empire. And you go, this is an aspect of good leadership and bad leadership that we see even in the real world. You can have a set of leaders who are pushing a direction for, say, a country or a town or whatever society or structure. And you may disagree with them vehemently about how they're going about it. But if they genuinely are trying to do what they think is best, if they are aiming for that, if they're aiming for what is best, you can be ideologically opposed to a lot of the things that they are doing, but they may be moving in that direction. Because while we talk about good archetype or bad archetype or shadow archetype, this is not a value call on what it is that they do. It's more about the ethos with which they are trying to do it.
Interesting. So Lysine, in that sense, is more ruler than tyrant because her motive is the good of the Empire, not the good of Lysine necessarily. And that's an interesting observation, considering she's not winning a whole lot of popularity contests.
and that's the thing. That's why we've spoken about this before, but that's why using the archetype to delve down into a character, because you could easily see, oh, Lysine is just a tyrant. But when you start thinking about what the tyrant means, that's when we get this insight into her motivation. When we look at the actions Lysine takes that we hear about, you go, well, that's not about her amusing herself. That's not about her just doing it for her own power. She's addressing problems in the only way that she knows how, which is actually a different thing. So that archetype, trying to think about that division between ruler and tyrant, thinking about that archetype actually provides a key insight into a character like Lysine, where a superficial reading would be very much, oh yeah, she's just a tyrant.
Well, let's take a similar example for a moment then. How about King Shrewd from the Farseer trilogy? Here's another ruler who you could say, and these are minor spoilers, but you could say this is a figure who is very clever in preserving his kingdom. And a lot of what he does, although you may not approve of the actions on a personal level, because he does things to certain characters that you like, who are part of the family, so to speak. You like these characters, but Shrewd exploits them. He exploits them brutally, harshly, but for the good of the realm. So is he a tyrant or is he a ruler? And that's, I feel like it's a tough call in some senses. What would be your take on that, AP?
But this is what I find fascinating, because rulership, by by this very conception that we're looking at, quite often involves a dictatorial stance.
Right.
And our modern conception, because we are surrounded by the concept of democracy and of individual freedom, we react very badly to directorial interference, to this dictatorial interference. We
Right.
automatically see that as bad, as negative.
Yeah.
And yet, because we're in a fantasy realm, because we are exploring concepts like this in the safe arena of fantasy, we can see aspects of how, even within a democracy, once something becomes law, you go, well, okay, we all voted on it, yeah, but I didn't vote for that one thing. And there's a dictatorial enforcement of it. Power is always being enforced against you.
Yeah.
And the one thing that we always hope is that our leaders, our elected representatives, the people that we have faith in, are doing it for the best of intentions, that are doing it for the best reasons, that have our best intentions at heart when they are doing these things.
Yeah.
And Shrewd, I think, is a great example of this.
Yeah.
Because that movement between what is a dictator, what is a tyrant, someone who lays down the law and cannot be disobeyed and is doing it for a way that secures their own power or is doing it for their own pleasure. We see elements of that in Shrewd, because a lot of his actions are guaranteeing the lineage, his line, his family's control of the duchies.
True.
That could be viewed very much as tyrannical and dictatorial. But at the same time, a lot of his actions are to elevate and protect and to serve the people of the six duchies, that he is trying to make their life better, that he is trying to stop the duchies being at war with one another, and to make everyone live in harmony. He has that approach as well. So I think rulership is a fascinating concept that using these archetypes can give us insight into.
Yeah, absolutely. Another example, one that one of the few books that I've read that you haven't in fantasy. This is rare, by the way, everyone. AP has read more fantasy books, I think, than anyone I know. So
that's not true.
More than anyone I know, that's true.
Have you seen the commenters who come to our channels?
Well,
They are
impressive
amazingly well read.
Yeah, of course.
Brilliant to see.
Oh, they're awesome. They're amazing. They humble me every time they leave comments. But you're very well read. But you haven't read Mark Lawrence's Red Queen's War trilogy, and there is a wonderful example of what we're talking about in there. In the Red Queen, in the title character, she's not the main character of the trilogy by any means, but she's an important character, and it's interesting because she's scary. She's really scary, very intimidating, very mysterious character who does some ruthless things for a bigger cause. And through the course of the trilogy, you do get some insight into her motives, and she becomes more understandable as a result. So she's a very interesting character in this respect, as to, you might at first be inclined to think of her as a tyrant, but then when you understand her better, you might see the ruler side of her. And it's a really fascinating journey. And that's not even the main part of the trilogy, but it's an important part of it in some respects. So, but there are lots of examples. You had one that I hadn't read before, and that was from Daughter of the Empire, I believe. The Myra of the...
Mara of the Acoma, Daughter of the Empire, the Empire trilogy by Johnny Wirtz and Raymond E. Feist. Mara of the Acoma. And I want to talk very specifically just about the first book, not the rest of the trilogy, because I don't want to ruin what happens in that trilogy, because I want you to read it, because then I want to talk to you about it.
I'm going to, yeah.
One of the reasons I wanted to bring up Mara is while we've been talking very much focused on ruler and tyrant, we've been talking about kings, we've been talking about emperors, we've been talking about queens and empresses. We can think of ruler at a lower level, and Mara of the Akoma begins the book as the daughter of a noble house, and the book basically opens with her about to take holy orders and give up all worldly connections and goods when she hears about her father and her brother's death, which
Hmm.
means she is now the lady of her noble house.
Huh.
And in that moment, she becomes a ruler. Now, she's not a queen, she is the lady of the Akoma.
Right.
But it is in that moment we follow her travails, her adventures, her solving these issues in this society as the lady of a noble house. And she takes on board the feelings and needs of her people. She consults with them, she takes advice from them. But ultimately, she is always the one that has to make the decision. She
Hmm.
has to do the thing. And it's that old adage, the buck stops here. And
Hmm.
she makes some brutal choices.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
yet, throughout all of it, we know that she is a good character. She is a nuanced character. She is a ruler rather than a tyrant. And we see through some of the other lords and ladies that we meet in that trilogy, the tyrants that evolve.
Yeah.
But even if we take it a step down from that, we can see it in when we see military units or when we see gangs, the difference between ruling through love and ruling through fear.
Hmm.
And you see that level of they are a good leader, they are a tyrant, they make people follow them out of fear, not
Right.
out of loyalty.
Right.
And we can see that stratification coming all the way down. People follow Do Jack and Whiskey Jack because they are loyal to the person.
Yeah.
People follow Lucine because they're worried about getting a knife in the back of the head sometime in the middle of the night. There, there's a difference in that leadership style that we could see as the difference between a good leader and a tyrant. But it
Right.
doesn't have to be king or queen or emperor and empress. It has to do with this aspect of leadership. And so
Yeah.
you see that as the person leading the quest group, the person leading the military unit, the person leading the gang.
Yeah.
Look at the lies of Loch Lamora and that whole storyline, that dynamic that they have in their gang, and then pick out the various characters in that trilogy who you would go, no, they are a tyrant, as opposed to that's a good leader.
Right.
So we can see that replicated, I think, at various different levels with various degrees of emphasis.
Indeed. Yes. I think so much of it does, once again, go back to this concept of the good archetypes being those who think of others. So a good ruler rules with her people in mind and tries to foster their well-being through her decisions, whereas a bad ruler is selfish and thinks only of herself. So an example of a bad ruler then maybe could be from Tigana, by Guy Gavriel Kay, where you have a ruler who has gone so far as to, and this is pretty much early in, or even on the back of the cover, so slight spoiler here, but the ruler in the beginning is somebody who is very acquisitive, has conquered a neighboring kingdom, and suffered a personal loss in the process. And as a result, this ruler has magical powers, has imposed a severe punishment on the kingdom that he conquered. So a great example, I think, of a tyrant, because it's all about me. It's about my pain. It's about what I went through, my suffering, and not even thinking about the suffering that he imposed on so many other people in the process of conquest. So,
I mean, I think an amusing example of this is if you think of the Austin Powers movies, where you have Doctor Evil, and it's the whole
yeah,
thing where when a minion comes in that's failed them, it's like, oh yes, kill them, and you
yeah,
drop them down into it. That evil, over the top, maniacal villain, where
right,
it's yeah. So someone was fielding a mission against the hero. If you're constantly killing your minions, where are you going to get more? It drives me nuts when we see that kind of lazy storytelling
I
in
know.
serious fiction. Like, it's brilliant, obviously, in parody, and we
Yeah.
can appreciate it in parody. But the reason it works as parody is because we've seen it so often done in serious fiction, where the evil villain has gone, "Oh, you have failed me. Execute them immediately." You're like, oh God. Whereas obviously when one of the hero's companions fails or has betrayed them because the evil person had some hold on them, the hero will forgive them and they will become more loyal, and they'll be, you know, we see those two different styles of the ruler, the king, the benevolent leader versus the evil dictatorial tyrant. But we
Yeah.
can see it in different ways explored throughout all of fantasy. And there are far too many to
Far too many.
discuss.
You mentioned David Eddings' books as ripe territory for archetype searching.
And this is, I mean, if anyone wanted to read a series where you essentially go, oh, that character, let me have a look in the archetype wheel. Ah, there they are. David Eddings was very good at picking this. I'm going with an archetype. I'm going with a very iconic version of a character because
Right.
it will have an emotional resonance. It will be easily identifiable, and people can live with it. And he does add in a tiny bit of nuance here and there, but
Okay.
for the most part, it is about that pattern. And so David Eddings' Belgariad is an interesting work that shows these archetypes very starkly realized at points.
Hmm.
If people needed very bold illustrations of it,
All
but
right.
I think we've covered these ones quite thoroughly. So
I think
all that
so.
remains is for me to say, Philip, thank you once again for coming on. This has been a real pleasure. And would you like to say goodbye to our viewers?
Absolutely, viewers. Thank you so much for watching us, having our fun. And I know that you are going to come up with more great examples, and I look forward to reading those in the comments.
So thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.